While other mobsters dressed in silk suits and diamond rings, Dutch Schultz wore rumpled clothes that made him look more like a vagrant than a millionaire. He was the mobster who hung a man from a meat hook by his thumbs, who gunned down rivals in the street, who built an empire on bootleg beer and blood. This is the story of the man who controlled New York's numbers game, terrorized Harlem, and became so dangerous that his own criminal allies had to kill him. The Bronx in the early 1900s was a place where dreams came to die. Tenement buildings rose like tombstones against the sky, packed with immigrant families who had crossed oceans believing America would deliver them from poverty. Instead, they found cramped apartments, dangerous factories, and the constant struggle to survive. Into this world, on August 6, 1901, Arthur Simon Flegenheimer was born. His parents, Herman and Emma, had married just 9 months earlier in Manhattan, two German Jews trying to build a life in a new country. Herman worked as a saloon keeper, a respectable enough profession, though one that kept him close to the rougher elements of the neighborhood. For the first 13 years of Arthur's life, the family managed to stay together, to maintain some semblance of normalcy. But in 1914, when Arthur was just entering his teenage years, Herman Flegenheimer walked out the door and never came back. No explanation, no goodbye. He simply vanished from their lives, leaving Emma to raise Arthur and his younger sister Helen alone. The abandonment would prove to be a turning point, the moment when whatever path Arthur might have taken toward legitimacy closed off forever. Suddenly, the family had no income. Emma was listed as divorced in the 1910 census, trying to maintain her dignity even as poverty closed in around them. Arthur, at 14, was forced to make a decision. He could stay in school, continue his education, and watch his mother and sister go hungry. Or he could drop out, find work, and help keep the family afloat. It was not really a choice at all. Arthur left school in the 8th grade and went looking for whatever work he could find. The jobs he took were the kind available to uneducated boys in the slums. Delivery work, odd jobs, menial labor that paid pennies. Around 1916, he found steadier employment with Schultz Trucking in the Bronx, a company that would give him not just a paycheck, but eventually a new identity. For 3 years, Arthur worked honest work, driving trucks, loading cargo, earning his keep. But honest work did not pay enough to support a family, and the streets of the Bronx offered other opportunities for a young man willing to take risks. Arthur began running with local gangs, learning the trade of petty crime. He robbed craps games, targeting illegal gambling operations where the victims could not go to the police. He committed burglaries, breaking into apartments and stealing whatever valuables he could carry. The work was dangerous, but it paid better than loading trucks, and for a teenager supporting his mother and sister, the risk seemed worth taking. He was good at it too, quick and ruthless, exactly the qualities that would later make him a successful gangster. But in 1919, Arthur's luck ran out. He was 17 years old when police caught him red-handed during a burglary attempt. The courts showed no mercy to repeat offenders, even young ones, and Arthur was sentenced to 17 months in prison. He was sent to Blackwell's Island, the notorious penal colony in New York's East River that would later be renamed Roosevelt Island. The facility was known for its harsh conditions and violent inmates, and Arthur Flegenheimer arrived there as a scared teenager facing his first taste of incarceration. Prison should have broken him. Instead, it hardened him into something much more dangerous. Arthur proved to be such an unmanageable prisoner, so violent and uncooperative, that prison officials transferred him to a work farm in Westhampton, Long Island, hoping the change of scenery might calm him down. It did not. Arthur escaped from the work farm, tasting freedom for a brief moment before being recaptured. The authorities added 2 months to his sentence as punishment, and Arthur learned an important lesson. Getting caught had consequences. He was finally released on parole on December 8, 1920, emerging from prison into a country that had changed dramatically during his incarceration. On January 16, 1920, the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution had gone into effect, prohibiting the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages throughout the nation. Prohibition, as it came to be known, was meant to civilize America, to reduce crime and corruption, to create a more moral society. Instead, it created the golden age of organized crime, and Arthur Flegenheimer was about to become one of its biggest beneficiaries. When Arthur returned to his old job at Schultz Trucking, he discovered that the company had adapted to the new legal landscape in a predictable way. They had become smugglers. The trucks that once carried legitimate cargo were now making runs to Canada, loading up with cases of illegal liquor and beer, and bringing them back across the border to be sold in New York City's thriving speakeasy scene. The profit margins were astronomical. A case of Canadian whiskey that cost a few dollars across the border could be sold for 10 times that amount in New York. The risk was high, but so were the rewards. Arthur signed on as a guard, riding shotgun on these illegal runs, his job to protect the valuable cargo from hijackers and rival smugglers. It was dangerous work. The routes from Canada to New York were prowled by other criminals looking to steal shipments and by federal agents looking to make arrests. But Arthur had proven in prison that he was not afraid of violence, and he quickly earned a reputation as someone you did not want to cross. It was during this period that Arthur Flegenheimer became Dutch Schultz. The exact origin of the name has been disputed over the years, with various theories proposed. Some claimed he took it from a tough street fighter from the 1800s who had earned a fearsome reputation in New York's gang wars. Others suggested it came from the son of the owner of Schultz Trucking, a boy whose nickname Arthur appropriated. What mattered was not where the name came from, but what it represented. A reinvention, a transformation from Arthur Flegenheimer, the son of German immigrants, into Dutch Schultz, the gangster. The name made sense for practical reasons. Flegenheimer was long, difficult to spell, and too ethnically identifiable. In the criminal underworld, where anonymity could mean the difference between freedom and prison, a shorter, tougher-sounding name was an asset. Dutch Schultz rolled off the tongue. It sounded dangerous. It was perfect. As Dutch made his runs to Canada and back, he was not just learning the smuggling trade. He was making connections, meeting the men who would shape his future in organized crime. He encountered Arnold Rothstein, the powerful Jewish mobster who had already made millions through gambling operations, and who would become known as the man who fixed the 1919 World Series. He met Charles Lucky Luciano, the young Italian gangster who would eventually organize crime families into a national syndicate. And he met Jack Legs Diamond, the Irish mobster who controlled much of Manhattan's bootlegging operations and who would later become one of Dutch's most dangerous enemies. By the mid-1920s, Dutch had learned enough and saved enough to strike out on his own. He took a job as a bouncer at the Hub Social Club, a small speakeasy in the Bronx owned by a gangster named Joey No. The Hub was the kind of place where working-class men came to drink illegal beer and play cards, where the bartender kept a shotgun under the counter, and everyone knew to keep their mouths shut if the police came around asking questions. Joey No saw something in Dutch Schultz that he liked. Maybe it was the cold determination in his eyes. Maybe it was his reputation for violence. Maybe it was simply that No needed a partner he could trust to be ruthless when ruthlessness was required. Whatever the reason, No approached Dutch with a proposition. They would go into business together, opening their own speakeasies and bootlegging operations, splitting the profits 50-50. Dutch agreed, and the partnership that would make both men wealthy began. They started small, opening illegal drinking establishments around the Bronx, places where workers could get a cold beer after a long shift. But Dutch and No had ambitions beyond running a few speakeasies. They wanted to control the supply chain, to be the ones selling beer to other establishments, to build an empire. To reduce their costs and increase their profits, they decided to handle their own transportation. They bought trucks and hired drivers, and they contracted with a brewer named Frankie Dunn, who operated out of Union City, New Jersey. Dunn produced cheap beer in large quantities, and Dutch and No would transport it across the river into New York, riding shotgun themselves to protect their investment from hijackers. They were not just saloon owners anymore. They were distributors, suppliers, and they were rapidly expanding their operations. But expansion brought competition, and in the bootlegging business, competition was often settled with violence rather than negotiation. Two brothers, John and Joe Rock, were already running their own bootlegging operation in the Bronx when Dutch and No arrived on the scene. The Rocks had their own customers, their own territory, and they were not interested in buying beer from the new competition. Dutch and No tried to convince them. They offered reasonable prices and reliable delivery. When that did not work, they tried intimidation. When that did not work, they decided to make an example that every other bootlegger in the Bronx would hear about. John Rock, the elder brother, eventually saw the wisdom in cooperating. He agreed to buy beer from the No Schultz operation, recognizing that resistance would only bring trouble. But Joe Rock, the younger brother, was stubborn. He refused to deal with Dutch and No, maintaining his independence even as the threats escalated. One night, Dutch and his men kidnapped Joe Rock off the street. They took him to a warehouse where they beat him savagely, breaking bones and leaving him barely conscious. But they were not done. In a display of cruelty that would become legendary in the criminal underworld, they hung Joe Rock from a meat hook by his thumbs, suspending him in the air while they continued to beat him. According to some accounts, they then took a gauze bandage that had been infected with gonorrhea discharge and wrapped it around his eyes, a method of torture so vile that it seemed to come from medieval times rather than 1920s New York. Rock's family eventually paid $35,000 for his release, a fortune in those days. When he was finally freed, Joe Rock went blind, though whether from the infected bandage or from the beating itself was never clear. What was clear was the message Dutch Schultz had sent. Cross him, and you would suffer in ways you could not imagine. After the Joe Rock incident, resistance to the No Schultz operation collapsed. Other bootleggers in the Bronx fell in line, buying their beer from Dutch and No, paying whatever price was asked. The partnership was making money faster than they could count it, pulling in millions of dollars as the speakeasies of New York operated around the clock to satisfy the public's thirst for illegal alcohol. Prohibition was supposed to make Americans stop drinking, but all it did was make them drink in secret. The speakeasies that replaced legal saloons were packed every night with factory workers, office clerks, society women, and businessmen, all united in their defiance of a law they considered unjust and unworkable. And the men who supplied those speakeasies, men like Dutch Schultz and Joey No, became millionaires. Dutch was 25 years old and already one of the most successful bootleggers in the Bronx. His operation was flourishing. His reputation for violence was keeping competitors at bay, and the money was rolling in faster than he had ever dreamed possible back when he was loading trucks for a few dollars a day. But Dutch was not satisfied with controlling just the Bronx. He looked across the Harlem River at Manhattan and saw opportunity everywhere. Manhattan was where the real money was. Manhattan had the nightclubs that attracted wealthy patrons, the restaurants where businessmen entertained clients, the society parties where champagne flowed like water. Manhattan was also more dangerous, with established gangs that would not take kindly to outsiders trying to muscle in on their territory. But Dutch Schultz had never been afraid of danger, and he and Joey No decided it was time to expand. They moved their headquarters to Manhattan's Upper West Side and began supplying speakeasies in Washington Heights, Yorkville, and Harlem. Almost immediately, they ran into trouble with Jack Legs Diamond, the Irish mobster who considered Manhattan his domain. Diamond was everything Dutch was not: flashy, charismatic, well-dressed, and politically connected. He had powerful friends in Tammany Hall, the political machine that controlled New York City, and he had an army of gunmen at his disposal. Diamond did not appreciate the No Schultz operation invading his territory, and he made his feelings known through violence. The conflict that erupted between the Dutch Schultz mob and the Legs Diamond mob would become one of the bloodiest gang wars of the Prohibition era, leaving bodies scattered across Manhattan and the Bronx, terrorizing neighborhoods and making headlines in every newspaper in the city. The war began with small skirmishes, hijacked trucks, burned warehouses, beatings of low-level soldiers. But it quickly escalated into open warfare, with drive-by shootings and targeted assassinations becoming commonplace. Both sides were losing men and losing money, and neither side was willing to back down. On October 16, 1928, the war claimed its first major casualty. Joey No, Dutch's partner, and one of the few men in the criminal underworld that Dutch considered a friend, was walking out of the Chateau Madrid, a speakeasy on West 54th Street in Manhattan, when gunmen opened fire. No was hit multiple times, the bullets tearing through his body, and he collapsed on the sidewalk in a pool of his own blood. He was rushed to Roosevelt Hospital, where doctors worked frantically to save his life. For a few days, it seemed like he might survive. But the damage was too severe, the internal injuries too extensive, and on November 21, 1928, Joey No died from his wounds. He was in his late 20s, cut down in the prime of his life by the same violence that had made him wealthy. Dutch Schultz was devastated. No had been more than a business partner. He had been a mentor, a friend, one of the few people in Dutch's life who had shown him loyalty and respect. The loss hurt in a way that Dutch was not accustomed to feeling, and he responded the only way he knew how, with revenge. Less than 2 weeks after No's death, on November 6, 1928, Arnold Rothstein was found fatally shot near the service entrance of the Park Central Hotel in Manhattan. Rothstein was not part of the Legs Diamond organization, but he was a close associate of Diamond's and a major figure in the Jewish mob. The murder sent shockwaves through the underworld. Arnold Rothstein was the man who had mentored a generation of gangsters, who had shown them how to organize crime like a business, who had connections that reached into the highest levels of society. Officially, the murder was attributed to a gambler named George "Hump" McManus, supposedly over an unpaid debt from a poker game. But many in the underworld believed Dutch Schultz had ordered the hit as retaliation for Joey No's death. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. The first call McManus made after the shooting was to Dixie Davis, Dutch Schultz's attorney. Bo Weinberg, one of Dutch's most trusted lieutenants, picked up McManus and drove him away from the murder scene. And Dutch Schultz, who had lost his best friend just days earlier, suddenly seemed satisfied that justice had been served. McManus was eventually cleared of the murder due to lack of evidence, and the case was never officially solved. But in the criminal underworld, where reputation mattered more than legal verdicts, everyone knew who had ordered Arnold Rothstein's execution. The war with Legs Diamond continued through 1929 and into 1930. Diamond himself survived multiple assassination attempts, including one at the Hotel Monticello on Manhattan's West Side, where gunmen burst into his room and shot him 5 times. Remarkably, Diamond survived, earning him a reputation as nearly impossible to kill. He went to Europe to recover, and when he returned, he set up operations in Albany, apparently recognizing that continuing the war with Dutch Schultz would eventually get him killed. But Dutch never forgot, and he never forgave. On December 18, 1931, Legs Diamond was murdered in his sleep at a cheap rooming house at 67 Dove Street in Albany. 2 gunmen entered his room and shot him 3 times, execution style. He was 34 years old. Though no one was ever convicted of the murder, the underworld knew who had given the order. Dutch Schultz had won the war, eliminated his biggest rival, and taken control of bootlegging operations throughout the Bronx and much of Manhattan. With No dead and Diamond eliminated, Dutch Schultz was now the sole boss of a bootlegging empire that was generating an estimated $2 million per week. He employed over 100 men, had dozens of speakeasies under his control, and supplied beer to hundreds of establishments throughout New York City. At 29 years old, he was one of the most powerful gangsters in America, a poor kid from the Bronx who had clawed his way to the top through intelligence, brutality, and an absolute refusal to back down from anyone. But success in the criminal underworld always came with complications, and Dutch Schultz was about to face challenges from both outside and inside his organization. The outside threat came in the form of another gangster, a violent young man named Vincent Cole, who would earn the nickname Mad Dog, and terrorize New York so thoroughly that even Dutch Schultz, who feared almost nothing, would barricade himself in his apartment in terror. The inside threat came from Dutch's own personality. His cheapness, his paranoia, his inability to treat his subordinates with the respect they felt they deserved. Vincent Cole had started out as one of Dutch's own men, an enforcer who handled collections and intimidation, the kind of dirty work that kept a criminal empire running. Cole was good at violence, maybe too good. He was reckless and unpredictable, the kind of man who would shoot first and never bother to ask questions later. He and his older brother Peter had become valuable assets to the Schultz organization, feared throughout the Bronx for their willingness to commit any act of violence Dutch ordered. But Vincent Cole wanted more than to be someone else's enforcer. He wanted to be a boss himself, to have his own territory, his own operations, his own fortune. In 1930, Cole approached Dutch and demanded to be made an equal partner in the organization. It was a bold move, considering that Cole was still in his early 20s and had nowhere near the experience or connections that Dutch possessed. Dutch refused. He saw in Cole what others saw, a useful killer but a terrible businessman, someone who lacked the self-control and strategic thinking necessary to run a criminal empire. Dutch explained that his organization operated differently from others. Instead of giving his men a percentage of their takings, which was the traditional arrangement, Dutch paid flat salaries. It was a system that gave Dutch more control and more profit, even if it meant his subordinates made less money than they might have in other organizations. Cole did not accept the rejection gracefully. He was furious at what he saw as disrespect, at being told he was not good enough to be an equal partner. In early 1931, Cole made a decision that would trigger one of the bloodiest gang wars in New York history. He quit the Schultz organization, took about a dozen of Dutch's men with him, and formed his own gang with the explicit goal of destroying Dutch Schultz and taking over his territory. The war that followed made the conflict with Legs Diamond look like a minor disagreement. Vincent Cole was younger, hungrier, and more reckless than Diamond had ever been. He did not care about politics or public opinion. He did not try to maintain a respectable facade or work within the unwritten rules that governed gang warfare. He simply attacked, again and again, with a fury that shocked even hardened criminals. The war claimed approximately 20 lives in the summer of 1931 alone. In May, just a few months after the split, Cole's gang murdered Peter Cole, Vincent's own brother. Peter was gunned down at night while driving through Harlem, shot through his car window by assassins who either mistook him for Vincent or were eliminating him because he had remained loyal to Dutch. Whether Peter had stayed loyal to Dutch or whether he was caught in the crossfire was never clear, but his death sent Vincent into a rage. Over the next 2 weeks, Vincent Cole personally murdered 4 of Dutch Schultz's men, hunting them down in the streets, shooting them in broad daylight, leaving their bodies as warnings to anyone who remained loyal to the Dutchman. Dutch was terrified. Vincent Cole was unpredictable in a way that even Legs Diamond had not been, and Dutch did something he had never done before. He barricaded himself in his apartment, surrounding himself with armed guards, refusing to venture out onto the streets where Cole might be waiting. The beer baron of the Bronx, the man who had hung Joe Rock from a meat hook and murdered Arnold Rothstein, was hiding in fear. Cole financed his war through kidnapping, a sideline business he had perfected. He would kidnap wealthy bootleggers and hold them for ransom, knowing his victims could not go to the police without explaining where their money came from. One of his most audacious kidnappings involved George Big Frenchy DeMange, the business partner of Oni, the killer Madden, who owned the famous Cotton Club in Harlem. Cole extracted $35,000 for DeMange's release, but in doing so, he made another powerful enemy in Oni Madden, who would not forget the insult. Then, on July 28, 1931, Vincent Cole made the mistake that would transform him from a dangerous criminal into a national villain. He was attempting to kidnap Joey Rao, one of Dutch Schultz's top lieutenants, who was standing outside the Helmer Social Club on East 107th Street in East Harlem. It was early evening, and the street was crowded with residents enjoying the summer weather. Children were playing on the sidewalk. A 14-year-old boy named Frank Scalesey was running a lemonade stand in front of the social club. 5-year-old Michael Vengeli was playing in the street with his brother and friends. A large touring car pulled up to the curb. Several men inside pointed shotguns and submachine guns at Joey Rao and opened fire. Rao threw himself to the sidewalk as bullets tore through the air. The gunmen kept firing, spraying the entire street with lead. When the car finally sped away, 4 children lay wounded on the pavement. 5-year-old Michael Vengeli had been hit. He was rushed to Beit David Hospital, where doctors worked desperately to save him, but the damage was too severe. Michael Vengeli died from his wounds, becoming the most innocent victim of the gang wars that had terrorized New York for years. The public was outraged. The newspapers, which had often romanticized gangsters as modern-day Robin Hoods, turned on Vincent Cole with a fury. New York Mayor Jimmy Walker, himself no stranger to corruption and backroom deals with organized crime, publicly denounced Cole as a mad dog, a rabid animal that needed to be put down. The nickname stuck. From that day forward, Vincent Cole would be known as Mad Dog Cole, the baby killer, the most wanted man in America. The manhunt for Cole was massive. The NYPD offered $10,000 for information leading to his arrest. Police Commissioner Edward Mulrooney issued a shoot-to-kill order, instructing his officers to gun Cole down on sight if they encountered him. Newspaper editors offered their own rewards. The entire city was searching for Mad Dog Cole. For 10 weeks, Cole evaded capture. He disguised himself with horn-rimmed glasses, dyed his hair black, and grew a mustache. He moved between hiding spots in the city and upstate New York, always one step ahead of the police. But on October 5, 1931, detectives finally tracked him down to the Cornish Arms Hotel, where he was hiding in a plush apartment with his girlfriend, Lottie Kreisberger. He surrendered peacefully, and the city breathed a sigh of relief that the mad dog had finally been caught. The trial began in December 1931, and it should have been an open and shut case. A 5-year-old boy was dead, shot down in broad daylight on a crowded street, and everyone knew Vincent Cole was responsible. But Cole had hired Samuel Leibovitz, one of the most brilliant defense attorneys in the country, a man who specialized in getting guilty men acquitted. Leibovitz attacked the prosecution's case with surgical precision. The main witness, George Brecht, claimed to have seen Cole at the scene of the shooting. But on the witness stand, under Leibovitz's withering cross-examination, Brecht admitted he had a criminal record and a history of mental health issues. More damning, he admitted he had testified as a professional witness in a previous murder case in St. Louis, essentially revealing that he made a living testifying at trials for money. The prosecution's case collapsed. The judge had no choice but to issue a directed verdict of not guilty. Vincent Cole walked out of the courtroom a free man, at least temporarily. A police inspector immediately told him he would be arrested on sight if he remained in New York City, but Cole had beaten the murder charge. When the inspector called him a baby killer, Cole replied hotly, "I'm no baby killer." But while awaiting trial, Mad Dog Cole had made another dangerous decision. Salvatore Maranzano, the most powerful mafia boss in New York, the self-styled boss of bosses, had hired Cole to murder Charles "Lucky" Luciano. Maranzano had just won the bloody Castellammius War, which had left dozens dead and established him as the undisputed leader of the Italian mob. But Maranzano was paranoid, convinced that Luciano would eventually try to kill him and take control. So he offered Cole $50,000 to eliminate Luciano, with $25,000 paid in advance. On September 10, 1931, Maranzano invited Luciano to a meeting at his office. The plan was for Cole to arrive during the meeting and gun down Luciano. But Luciano had his own network of informers, and he had learned of the plot. Instead of going to the meeting himself, Luciano sent a team of his own hitmen who arrived at Maranzano's office and stabbed and shot the boss of bosses to death. When Cole arrived to carry out the hit, he encountered Luciano's men fleeing the scene. They told him Maranzano was dead, and Cole simply walked away, $25,000 richer for a job he never had to complete. Now Mad Dog Cole had enemies everywhere. Dutch Schultz wanted him dead. Oni Madden wanted him dead for kidnapping Big Frenchie Demange. and Lucky Luciano, now the most powerful gangster in New York, knew that Cole had been hired to kill him. Between them, they put a $50,000 bounty on Cole's head. Dutch Schultz was so desperate to see Cole dead that he walked into a Bronx police station and offered a house in Westchester to any officer who would kill him. On February 1, 1932, gunmen invaded a Bronx apartment that Cole was rumored to frequent. They opened fire with pistols and submachine guns, killing 3 people, including 2 of Cole's gang members, Patsy Del Greco and Fiorio Basil. An innocent bystander, Emily Tanzillo, was also killed in the fusillade. But Cole himself was not there. 1 week later, on February 8, 1932, Vincent Mad Dog Cole walked into the London Chemist drugstore at 312 West 23rd Street in Manhattan. He entered a phone booth to make a call, reportedly to Oni Madden, to discuss a possible truce. While Cole was on the phone, 2 gunmen walked into the drugstore. One of them positioned himself at the door of the phone booth, raised a submachine gun, and opened fire. Witnesses disagreed on how many shots were fired. Some said 15, others claimed 50. The phone booth was torn apart by the barrage, the glass shattering, the wood splintering. When the gunmen finally backed out of the store and disappeared into the night, the door of the phone booth swung slowly open, and Vincent Cole's body pitched forward onto the floor. He had been hit 3 times in the head, 3 times in the chest, once in the abdomen, and 8 times in the arms and legs. He was 23 years old. Part 2. The numbers king with Vincent Cole dead and Legs Diamond eliminated. Dutch Schultz stood at the pinnacle of his criminal power. By 1932, he controlled bootlegging operations throughout the Bronx and significant portions of Manhattan. He employed over 100 men, operated dozens of speakeasies, and was generating millions of dollars in revenue. But Dutch could see the writing on the wall. The public mood was shifting. The noble experiment of prohibition was failing spectacularly, and politicians were beginning to discuss repeal. Dutch needed a new source of income, something that would survive the end of bootlegging. He found it in Harlem, in an illegal lottery called the numbers game. The numbers racket, also known as policy banking, was brilliantly simple. A gambler would pick 3 numbers between 0 and 999 and place a bet with a numbers runner. The next day, winning numbers would be determined by some agreed-upon random source, often the last 3 digits of the total handle at a local racetrack, or the daily U.S. Treasury balance published in newspapers. If your numbers hit, you won a substantial payout, usually 600 to 1 on your bet. If you lost only the small amount you had wagered, maybe a nickel or a dime. For poor people who had no access to legitimate banking or investment opportunities, the numbers game served as a form of savings and hope. You could bet a few pennies and dream of winning enough money to pay rent, buy food, or escape poverty for a while. During the Great Depression, when millions were unemployed and desperate, the numbers game became even more important. It was one of the few ways working-class people, especially African Americans who were excluded from most legitimate financial institutions, could participate in anything resembling economic investment. By the late 1920s, Harlem had become the center of Black America, a flourishing community with its own artists, musicians, writers, and intellectuals creating what became known as the Harlem Renaissance. And alongside this cultural flowering, Harlem had developed a thriving underground economy with the numbers game at its heart. By 1930, approximately 30 numbers operations were running in Harlem, generating millions of dollars annually. Nearly all of them were run by African Americans, with the profits staying in the Black community, funding legitimate businesses, supporting families, and providing employment for thousands of numbers runners who collected bets and delivered winnings. Among the most successful of these operators was a woman named Stephanie St. Clair, known throughout Harlem as Madame Queen or the Queen of the Policy Rackets. She was born in Guadeloupe in the French West Indies, though the exact year remains disputed, with some records saying 1887 and others 1897. St. Clair herself apparently encouraged the confusion, understanding that mystery was an asset in the criminal world. What is certain is that she arrived in New York around 1911 as a young woman, educated and able to read in both French and English, making her far more literate than most Americans of any race at that time. St. Clair worked various jobs before entering the numbers racket, reportedly escaping an abusive employer who assaulted her. By 1917, she had saved $10,000 and invested it in running her own numbers bank in Harlem. She proved to be a natural businesswoman, understanding mathematics, managing risk, and building a network of runners who collected bets throughout the neighborhood. Within a few years, she was one of the most successful policy operators in Harlem, pulling in substantial daily profits and becoming wealthy enough to purchase apartment buildings and invest in legitimate businesses. She was also a vocal advocate for her community. St. Clair took out advertisements in Harlem's newspapers, educating black citizens about their voting rights and legal protections. She spoke out against police brutality and corruption. When officers shook down her runners or demanded bribes, she fought back publicly, eventually testifying before the Seabury Commission investigating police corruption in New York. She told the commission she had paid $6,600 in bribes to police officers over the years, a revelation that led to some officers being dismissed. In her own way, Stephanie St. Clair saw herself as more than a gangster. She was a businesswoman providing a service her community wanted and defending her people against a corrupt system that oppressed them. She worked closely with her chief enforcer, Ellsworth "Bumpy" Johnson, a man who would later become a legend in his own right as the most powerful black gangster in Harlem. Together, St. Clair and Bumpy Johnson built one of the most successful numbers operations in the city, employing countless black men and women and keeping the profits within the African American community. But in 1933, everything changed. The 21st Amendment repealed prohibition, and the golden age of bootlegging came to an end. Suddenly, gangsters who had made fortunes selling illegal alcohol found their revenue streams drying up. They needed new rackets, and they turned their attention to Harlem's numbers game. They saw black operators like Stephanie St. Clair making millions of dollars, and they wanted that money for themselves. Dutch Schultz was the first major white gangster to move aggressively into Harlem. His approach was characteristically brutal. He identified the major numbers operators and gave them an ultimatum. They could hand over their entire business to him and work as his employees, or they could continue operating independently, but pay him a substantial percentage of their profits. If they refused either option, they would face violence. Dutch sent his enforcers into Harlem to beat and intimidate numbers runners. He murdered operators who would not submit. He set fire to stores that served as numbers drops for independent operators. He was systematic and ruthless, and most of the black numbers bankers, faced with Dutch's reputation for extreme violence and his army of over 100 armed men, reluctantly surrendered their businesses or agreed to pay him protection money. Stephanie St. Clair refused. She declared publicly that she was not afraid of Dutch Schultz or any other living man. She said he would never touch her, that she would kill him herself if he set foot in Harlem. She called him a rat who was stealing from black people and destroying businesses that belonged to her community. And then she went to war. St. Clair organized the remaining independent black policy operators into a resistance movement. She personally visited white-owned stores that were collecting numbers bets on Dutch's behalf. She walked in with rocks in her hands and smashed plate glass cases. She destroyed policy slips. She set fires. She physically threw people out of their stores and warned them that if they continued working for Dutch Schultz, they would face consequences. She took out advertisements in newspapers encouraging Harlem residents to play black, to only place their bets with black numbers operators instead of the white-owned operations controlled by Dutch. It was an early version of a Buy Black campaign, framing the fight not just as a turf war between criminals, but as a battle for black economic independence. Dutch retaliated with typical violence. He called St. Clair's home to threaten her directly. He kidnapped and murdered some of her runners. He put a contract out on her life, forcing her to go into hiding. At one point, She hid in a cellar while a friendly building superintendent covered her with coal to conceal her from Dutch's hitmen who were searching the building. Another time, Dutch sent one of his men to intimidate her, but St. Clair managed to push the man into a closet, lock him inside, and have her bodyguards take care of him. Part 3. The end of the Dutchman. In January 1933, a federal grand jury indicted Dutch Schultz for income tax evasion. The government alleged that he had earned nearly $2 million between 1929 and 1931, but had failed to file any tax returns or pay a single dollar in federal taxes. It was the same strategy that had brought down Al Capone 2 years earlier, and Thomas Dewey intended to use it to destroy Dutch Schultz. Dutch knew the danger he faced. He had watched Capone, once the most powerful gangster in America, get sentenced to 11 years in federal prison for tax evasion. He understood that the government could not prove most of his criminal activities, but they could prove he had made money and had not paid taxes on it. So Dutch did what any sensible fugitive would do. He went into hiding. For nearly 2 years, Dutch evaded capture, moving between hideouts in upstate New York and Connecticut. He grew a mustache and dyed his hair to change his appearance. He operated his criminal empire through intermediaries, while FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover named him public enemy number 1, the most wanted man in America. But hiding was expensive and complicated, and Dutch's businesses were suffering without his direct oversight. His subordinates were stealing from him. Rivals were encroaching on his territory, and worst of all, Lucky Luciano was positioning himself to take over Dutch's entire operation the moment Dutch was convicted. Bo Weinberg, Dutch's chief lieutenant and one of his most trusted men, had grown tired of working for a boss who paid poorly and seemed headed for prison. Weinberg reached out to Lucky Luciano and proposed a deal. If Luciano helped arrange Dutch's conviction or elimination, Weinberg would help Luciano take control of the Schultz organization. Luciano agreed enthusiastically. He saw Dutch's tax troubles as an opportunity to absorb one of the last major independent operations in New York. All he had to do was wait for Dutch to be convicted and sent to prison. Then the Schultz empire would collapse and Luciano could pick up the pieces. But Dutch was not going to prison without a fight. In November 1934, after nearly 2 years as a fugitive, Dutch surrendered to authorities in Albany. His lawyers had negotiated a deal. In exchange for his surrender, they would request a change of venue, moving his trial from New York City, where Dutch was universally hated, to somewhere upstate where the jury pool might be more sympathetic. The strategy worked. Dutch's trial was scheduled for Syracuse, a small city in central New York where most potential jurors were farmers and working-class people who had little love for the federal government or its tax collectors. Dutch arrived in Syracuse and immediately began a charm offensive. He gave interviews to local newspapers, portraying himself as a misunderstood businessman being persecuted by an overreaching government. He donated money to local businesses. He attended church services. He tried to present himself as just a regular guy who happened to be wealthy. His first trial began in April 1935. The prosecution, led by John McEvers, who had been part of the team that convicted Al Capone, presented overwhelming evidence that Dutch had made millions of dollars, but had never filed a tax return. They called bankers who detailed Dutch's bootlegging income. They subpoenaed witnesses, though many went into hiding rather than testify against the Dutchman. Some witnesses who did appear suddenly developed amnesia on the stand or pleaded the Fifth Amendment, even when threatened with contempt charges. Dutch's defense was simple but surprisingly effective. His lawyers argued that he had actually tried to pay his taxes. They produced evidence showing that Dutch had sent his attorneys to the Internal Revenue Service in Washington with $100,000 in cash as a settlement offer. The IRS had refused, claiming he owed much more. Dutch's lawyers argued to the jury that their client was willing to fulfill his civic duty, but the government had rejected his good faith attempt to settle his debt. Despite the government's overwhelming evidence, the jury deadlocked. After 2 days of deliberations, they were hopelessly split. 6-6 on the first day, then 7-5 for conviction on the second day. The judge had no choice but to declare a mistrial. Dutch had escaped, at least temporarily, but the government was not finished. Prosecutor Thomas Dewey immediately scheduled a second trial, this time in Malone, a tiny town in upstate New York near the Canadian border. Malone was even more remote than Syracuse, with a population of only a few thousand people, most of them farmers who had suffered through the Great Depression and harbored deep resentment toward wealthy city folk and federal authorities. Dutch arrived in Malone a week before his trial began and launched what one historian called a social rampage. He bought rounds of drinks in every tavern in town. He picked up dinner tabs at restaurants. He donated jerseys to the local semi-pro baseball team. He attended a baseball game with the mayor and prominent businessmen sitting in the stands like any other sports fan. He gave toys to sick children at the local hospital. He donated money to churches. He tipped in $100 bills. Everywhere he went, Dutch was charming, generous, friendly. He transformed himself from the feared beer baron of the Bronx into Dutch Schultz, the country squire and good neighbor. The trial began in June 1935. Once again, the prosecution presented damning evidence. Once again, witnesses were reluctant to testify or suddenly could not remember key details. But this time, Dutch had won over the town. The jurors, who had received his generosity directly or indirectly, saw him not as a dangerous gangster, but as a successful businessman being harassed by an intrusive federal government. On August 1st, 1935, the jury returned a verdict of not guilty. The courtroom erupted in cheers and applause. The townspeople celebrated. Dutch had beaten the federal government twice, an almost unprecedented achievement, but the presiding judge was furious. He addressed the jury with barely contained rage, telling them their verdict shook the confidence of law-abiding citizens in integrity and truth. He said it was apparent to anyone who followed the evidence that they had reached a verdict not on the evidence, but on some other reason, presumably Dutch's pretrial generosity. The judge said they had rendered a blow against law enforcement and given aid to people who would flout the law. His words fell on deaf ears. Dutch was free, but the victory was Pyrrhic. New York Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia was so outraged at the verdict that he issued an order barring Dutch from entering New York City. If Dutch set foot in the 5 boroughs, he would be arrested on sight. Dutch was free from federal prison, but he was exiled from his own city, from the territory where his criminal empire was based, from the speakeasies and numbers operations that generated his wealth. Dutch relocated to Newark, New Jersey, just across the river from Manhattan. He set up headquarters at the Palace Chop House, a restaurant at 12 East Park Street that became his office and meeting place. From Newark, he tried to maintain control of his operations in New York, but it was increasingly difficult. His numbers operators in Harlem were rebelling. His subordinates were stealing from him, and Lucky Luciano, who had been patiently waiting for Dutch to be convicted, now realized that Dutch was going to remain free and in control of his empire. Even worse, while Dutch had been fighting his tax battles, Luciano and other major gangsters had reorganized the underworld into what became known as the Commission, a ruling body that mediated disputes between crime families and made decisions affecting organized crime throughout the country. The Commission included the bosses of the 5 families of New York, as well as representatives from other major cities. It was designed to prevent the kind of violent gang wars that had killed so many men in the previous decade, to provide structure and rules to the criminal underworld. Dutch had missed this organizational shift while he was in hiding and on trial. He did not understand that the rules had changed, that individual gangsters could no longer act unilaterally without consequences. He was operating under old rules in a new world, and that would prove fatal. Thomas Dewey had not given up on prosecuting Dutch Schultz. After the acquittals, Dewey focused on building cases for other charges: restaurant extortion, labor racketeering, violations of state gambling laws. Dewey was ambitious, smart, and relentless. He saw Dutch Schultz as the stepping stone to a political career. If he could bring down the beer baron of the Bronx, he could run for governor, maybe even president. He was not going to stop until Dutch was either in prison or dead. Dutch became obsessed with Dewey. He believed, probably correctly, that as long as Dewey was alive, he would face constant prosecution and investigation. His businesses would suffer. His income would be threatened. He would never be able to return to New York City or operate openly. In Dutch's mind, there was only one solution. Thomas Dewey had to die. In the fall of 1935, Dutch requested an emergency meeting of the commission. He traveled to New York and sat down with Lucky Luciano, Mayor Lansky, Albert Anastasia, Louis Lepke Buchalter, and other major figures in organized crime. Dutch made his proposal. The commission should authorize the assassination of Thomas Dewey. The room fell silent. What Dutch was proposing was unprecedented. Gangsters killed each other all the time. They killed witnesses. They killed informers. They killed rivals and competitors. But they did not kill prosecutors, especially not high-profile prosecutors with political connections and the full backing of the law enforcement establishment. Dutch argued that Dewey was a threat to everyone, that if he could destroy Dutch Schultz, he could destroy any of them. He said killing Dewey would send a message that the mob would not be intimidated. Luciano responded carefully. He explained that killing a prosecutor of Dewey's stature would bring catastrophic consequences. The federal government would declare war on organized crime. Law enforcement would receive unlimited resources. Politicians would compete to show who could be toughest on the mob. Every gangster in America would face intense scrutiny and prosecution. It would be bad for business, bad for everyone. The other commission members agreed. Albert Anastasia and Jacob Shapiro voiced some support for the idea, but they were outvoted. The commission unanimously voted against authorizing the hit on Thomas Dewey. Dutch exploded in rage. He stood up, shouted at the assembled gangsters, and declared that he would kill Dewey anyway. He did not need their permission. He would handle it himself within 48 hours. Then he stormed out of the meeting. The commission members looked at each other in shocked silence. Dutch Schultz had just openly defied the commission, the governing body of organized crime. He had announced his intention to do something that would bring disaster to everyone. They could not allow it. Dutch was not bluffing. He immediately contacted Albert Anastasia, who ran Murder Incorporated, the enforcement arm of the mob that carried out contract killings. Dutch asked Anastasia to begin surveillance on Dewey's apartment building on Fifth Avenue. He wanted to know Dewey's schedule, his routines, when he came and went. Anastasia, who had just voted against killing Dewey, pretended to go along with Dutch's request. But as soon as Dutch left, Anastasia went directly to Lucky Luciano and reported everything. Luciano called another emergency meeting of the commission. This time, there was only one item on the agenda: what to do about Dutch Schultz. They deliberated for 6 hours. The conclusion was inevitable. Dutch Schultz had become too dangerous, too unstable, too much of a threat. He was going to kill Dewey, and that would destroy them all. There was only one solution. The commission ordered Louis Lepke Buchalter to eliminate the Dutchman. Murder Incorporated was given the contract. 2 days later, on the evening of October 23, 1935, Dutch Schultz sat at a table in the back room of the Palace Chop House in Newark. With him were 3 of his most trusted men. Otto Berman, his accountant, known throughout the underworld as Abadabba for his genius with numbers. Abraham Landor, his new chief lieutenant who had replaced Bo Weinberg. And Bernard Rosenkrantz, nicknamed Lulu, his personal bodyguard and one of the few men Dutch truly trusted. They had finished dinner and were discussing business, going over the ledgers, planning the week's collections from the numbers racket. At around 10 o'clock, Dutch excused himself and walked to the men's room at the back of the restaurant. It was a decision that would cost him his life. As Dutch stood at the urinal, 2 men entered the Palace Chop House. One was Charles Workman, known as the Bug, a professional killer with over 24 murders to his credit. The other was Emmanuel Weiss, called Mendy, another experienced hitman from Murder Incorporated. They walked through the bar area, past the few remaining customers, heading toward the back room where Dutch's men were sitting. Workman opened the door to the men's room and saw Dutch Schultz standing alone, vulnerable. Workman raised his .45 caliber pistol and fired. The bullet hit Dutch in the abdomen, tearing through his stomach and liver before lodging near his spine. Dutch collapsed to the floor, mortally wounded but still conscious. Workman then joined Weiss in the back room. They opened fire on the three men at the table. The noise was deafening in the enclosed space. Abadabba Berman was hit multiple times and collapsed immediately. Abe Landor took a bullet to the carotid artery that nearly decapitated him. Lulu Rosenkrantz was shot repeatedly at point-blank range, bullets ripping through his chest and abdomen. Remarkably, despite their catastrophic injuries, Landor and Rosenkrantz managed to rise to their feet. They pulled their own weapons and returned fire, driving the assassins out of the restaurant. Workman and Weiss fled into the night, disappearing before police arrived. The police found a scene of carnage. Abadabba Berman lay dead at the table. His brilliant criminal career ended at age 42. Abe Landor was dying, blood pouring from the wound in his neck. Lulu Rosenkrantz was barely alive, his body shattered by multiple gunshot wounds. And in the men's room, Dutch Schultz lay on the floor in a spreading pool of blood, a single bullet having destroyed his internal organs. Ambulances rushed the wounded men to New York City Hospital. Abadabba Berman was pronounced dead on arrival. Abe Landor died within hours. Lulu Rosenkrantz lingered through the night, but he had lost too much blood and his injuries were too severe. He died the next morning. Only Dutch Schultz remained alive, though barely. Doctors performed emergency surgery on Dutch, but they were unaware of the full extent of his injuries. The bullet had ricocheted through his abdominal cavity, perforating his stomach, damaging his liver, tearing through his intestines. Even worse, the bullets Workman had used were rust-coated, deliberately designed to cause blood poisoning if the gunshot wound alone did not prove fatal. Dutch developed peritonitis, a massive infection of the abdominal cavity. His fever soared to 106 degrees. He drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid, more often delirious. The Newark Police Department, desperate for information about who had ordered the hit, assigned a stenographer named F.J. Lang to sit at Dutch's bedside and record everything he said. For 22 hours, as Dutch fought for his life, Lang wrote down every word that escaped his lips. What emerged was one of the strangest documents in American criminal history. Dutch's last words, dictated in fever and morphine-induced delirium, were a stream of consciousness ramble that veered between moments of clarity and passages of pure surrealism. Police hoped he would name his killers, confess to his crimes, reveal the location of his hidden fortune. Instead, they got poetry. During his few lucid moments, Dutch was visited by his wife Frances, a young woman he had married only months earlier. They had never gone through an official marriage ceremony, making her technically his common-law wife, though Dutch called her his spouse. When Frances came to his bedside and spoke to him, Dutch begged her to help him. He complained that they had dyed his shoes and that he could not get up. He asked for water. He begged Danny, whoever that was, to please get him in the car. Then he slipped back into delirium.